Welcome to the Schiller Institute event here on, I'd like to say it's the New Silk Road becoming the world land bridge, but it's in a way even bigger than that in terms of the potential that is being created for really a new paradigm for mankind, which certainly has the economic component. It certainly is the what is going on with the New Silk Road, but it's even more fundamental in terms of a shift in thinking and a shift in identity of humanity. And I see it as a fruition of the tradition of the Renaissance, which really was based on the question of imago viva Dei, right? Man in the image of God, which I don't mean that from a religious standpoint. I think actually Mr. LaRouche once asked it in the most interesting way. He says, what is God such that man were in his image? And if you look at what Mr. LaRouche has done with his economic science, his philosophies and so on, it's to approach that there is an effect of the creative output of humanity. We've seen that. It is fundamentally different than that of the animals. The animals can't do what human beings can do. And that concept is that the difference between man and animal, but also the creative output measured in terms of economic progress, is what LaRouche has made a science of physical economy. And that concept is what the nations of the world are now uniting around. And we see it expressed in the Silk Road, which I like this schematic here. For those of you that have gone to different countries in Europe, for example, and looked at their subway maps, it kind of uses that idea, but which usually you think of the subway as a small city. This takes an entire couple of continents, I suppose, and sort of gives that same impression that that's how close the world can become through China's New Silk Road project, which, as many of you know, Mr. LaRouche and his wife began organizing around in the early 1990s. So after about a 20-year period of holding seminars and organizing around this concept, the president of China, Xi Jinping, in 2013 announced that this was official policy by China, but not just for China. This is obviously taking the nations of Central Asia, nations of the Middle East eventually, as it becomes consolidated, and bringing it into a full development corridor potential where mankind can come together around the common aims of mankind. Now, as people know, what LaRouche had envisioned was not just simply for the Eurasian continent. This was to be a global policy. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Cooper a little bit later, but people see this little, the connection there of the Bering Strait, of actually building a tunnel. We could do a bridge. That was the proposal back in the late 1800s. There was a proposal for this very same connection under William McKinley. That outlook, the governor of the Oregon territories at the time, Galpin, I think his name was an advocate of this concept.
William Gilpin.
Yep. So, so this would be then, of course, the way to bring the United States into this grand vision for mankind. Now, the reason we haven't done this is not because it doesn't make sense economically. The reason is the geopolitical reality of the fact that the British Empire is still around. And so what I would actually like to do is present what we mean by the British Empire and what we mean by British geopolitics, which on the one hand is to prevent this kind of collaboration going, and is to prevent a long-standing policy that literally goes back to the middle of the 1800s, actually even longer than that, of the British Empire and the Venetian Empire before that, ensuring that Asia did not connect to Europe via the interior of the landmass, but instead that the British Empire would maintain their maritime empire, which this kind of gives the pompous sense of the British of how they thought of all of their various colonies, and showing, of course, all of the key shipping lanes between them. But as people can see, whether it be South Africa, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, India, Gibraltar, they controlled all the crucial shipping lanes because that's how they ran their empire. And then what they did is they ran divide and conquer strategies on the interior of the continents. And so that is the British geopolitics, and I'd like to just get into a little bit of the history of that in terms of what the policy was, but also to get at the later manifestation of the British Empire, which was much more of the empires of the mind, as Winston Churchill once said. Right? He said that the future of the British Empire was going to be the empires of the mind. Now, what I'd like to get at is that what oftentimes people think of as the various isms, right, that they look to the other nations and they say, we can't collaborate with those nations. We can't collaborate with China because that's the communism. We can't collaborate with Russia because of their communism or socialism, or even those that might have a different sense of how things work, what fascism was, right? But what I'd like to present is that fascism, socialism, communism, and environmentalism as a policy, not as what people think about of being good to the birds and not kicking puppies and making sure we don't dump mercury into our water, things like that, but the actual policy of environmentalism. All of these have a common root, and that common root is the British Empire, and it is not, it is just another version of feudalism, essentially. That's probably the core of it all, really, is the feudalist policy. So I want to get into that, and we'll do that through one of the key figures of the British Empire for the modern century, which is Lord Bertrand Russell. And some of you know that Mr. LaRouche has identified Lord Bertrand Russell as the most evil man of the 20th century. So actually, Paul Glumaz, who's going to give the next set of the presentation, actually did a very good article that goes into Russell's history, which I forgot to tell our crew in the back to print it off. But anyway, you can get it on the site. Yeah, John.
A couple cents. Bertrand Russell is known for socialism, or who is exactly?
Yeah, Bertrand Russell is often seen, he's noted as a mathematician. He's often referred to as a philosopher. He is wrongly promoted as a peace activist. But what he did, and we'll get to this in a little bit of it, is Maoism of China, or at least the philosophical underpinnings of it, whether Mao had his personal disagreements with Russell on tactics and things like that. These were Russell's projects. Pol Pot, and it all was revolved around the idea of the noble savage, that you actually you wanted to prevent economic development, and which is the common underpinning of all these various isms that we see, communism, socialism, as an organized policy. But it was Russell that was going around organizing these nations around it. So we'll come back to that. But I just want to situate what we're doing here on this question of the British Empire, that this is, though we will go back hundreds of years to look at how they're operating, to give an insight into what's going on right now, this is not some timeless fight that here we are gathered in this room and we're all just sort of historians academically discussing how, the development of humanity and so on. We're in a pitched brawl that has to be decided right now about which version of mankind succeeds. Are we going to, well, at this point it's a little bit like what Abraham Lincoln said. You cannot have a nation half slave, half free. Right? That was, of course, a reference to the fact that we were gripped by the Civil War then, which was British instigated. But same thing now. The planet is at the point where you can't have the British oligarchy and this imperial agenda operable at the same time that you have the emergence of this new paradigm led by this new Silk Road. And what is going on is that there is, even though you don't hear much about it, actually I'm just sort of curious, how many of you in this room have heard about the fact that there's a major summit in Asia next month? Well, actually in about 3 weeks. How many of you have heard that in the media and not?
Trump?
Huh?
Talking about Trump.
Well, Trump will be going there. Trump will be going to this. There's the ASEAN summit, and there's also the APEC summit. There's some other kind of other meetings that are going on and someone on the sidelines and so on.
Trump mentioned that on Fox News.
Oh, he did. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, what you may not have heard in the media is that what we intend to do, what this movement intends to do, is make this the moment that Donald Trump signals his intention to move on the new paradigm and join this new Silk Road project. Now, what do I mean by that? Do I mean that Trump is going to go to the conference and, link arms with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and, skip through the room and say we're all going with the new paradigm? That's probably not likely in the sense that it happens like that, but there are very subtle things that Trump could do that could indicate an openness that the United States can begin to collaborate with China economically and strategically, and Russia. Now, all of us have some sense that Trump has signaled that he's open to that, and that the ongoing coup d'etat to overthrow him is to prevent that from occurring. And so what we have done is, in addition to promoting that Trump does go to Asia, and that he does begin give the signal or begin moving that the United States is going to collaborate with Russia and China on the new Silk Road, and actually extend this across the Bering Strait and eventually into the kind of infrastructure policy that we've heard Trump talk about. It maybe in a smaller version, but he has mentioned talking about infrastructure development, and it's got to be at this scale if the United States is going to survive. So anyway, so whether this is actually discussed directly and openly at the upcoming meetings in November in Asia, the point is we want to make sure that it is moving in that direction. Now, to give at least an indication of the openness right now, one of our colleagues, Mike Stager, maybe some of you have met him, who's come up here for different events. He was at the China Day celebration, kind of their National Day celebration, at an event at the San Francisco consulate, the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. And none other than Jerry Brown was there, the current governor of California, who we definitely haven't always had a very good relationship with, going way back. But he was there, and he said that Xi Jinping had personally told him that California was a part of the One Belt, One Road, a part of the new Silk Road concept. And then Jerry Brown went on to say, and so California is going to take the lead in joining the new Silk Road, and as California goes, so goes the nation, which is somewhat politically true. So that is very interesting, and actually all of the West Coast governors, from Alaska you had Governor Walker, You had Governor Inslee here in Washington State, and Governor Brown, I forget her first name, Kate Brown, in Oregon, all gave video presentations at this same meeting at the Chinese consulate, also indicating their willingness to work with China as well. That is very unique. That is something that we have been fighting for, is that kind of recognition of China's New Silk Road project for a long time, decades. So now we have at least the beginning openings of this, and since that point, and actually sort of ongoing, a number of different governors from all over the state, from Iowa, the list goes on, have also gone to China and discussed the fact that what China is doing is a virtual economic miracle. Okay, so that's what we intend to do, is to continue to break this open, and that Trump's trip to Asia be a major move towards the United States actually entering this new paradigm, okay? Now, at the same time, this is occurring in the middle of total global financial meltdown, or that we're on the edge of a new, something that will make 2007, 2008, remember when the stock market and everything, I mean, we had banks going under like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, etc. What is about to hit will make that look like Disneyland. We're looking at the end of the transatlantic financial system, because since that moment they have done nothing but just pump money into the system. And now this is actually being recognized by major institutions. For example, the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of International Settlements, which is sort of like the central bank of the central banks, so like the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, that's kind of the last clearinghouse there is this Bank of International Settlements. But both the IMF and the Bank of International Settlements have put out reports saying that because of the low interest rates that the central banks have been operating on, that corporations are getting cheap money, and what are they doing with that cheap money? Are they turning it around and investing into new plant and equipment and new scientific innovations, new technologies to make the economy more efficient and better and so on? No. They're taking that cheap money and they're buying up their own stock. So all this zooming sky-high stock market, I don't even know what Dow Jones is, at over 20,000 now?
23,000.
23,000. Dear God. Okay, so that's a gigantic financial bubble that is, it's like incest. You know, if you're just taking cheap money and buying up your own stock, you're not doing anything. You're just kicking the can down the road to the point where somebody says, wait a sec, this thing is an entire fraud. Now, that fraud is increasingly being discussed by prominent people. For example, Wolfgang Schäuble, who is the outgoing finance minister, who, if Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who was Lyndon LaRouche's wife, if you've ever heard her talk about Wolfgang Schäuble, she has very little good to say about the guy, right? But on his way out, he just says, look, this whole thing there's major economists around the world talking about the oncoming collapse. I agree with them. Essentially, this thing is coming down. So if you have people discussing it in those terms, like finance ministers, you know, in this case retired heads of major institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of International Settlements, openly discussing this, how much longer can it go? Now, the point is, and I believe that largely why anyone stays in the game, so-called. You know, I talked to an investment banker the other day who was basically like, all we're trying to do, everybody knows the thing's coming down, we just have to convince our people to stay in and keep their money in, because, you know, with volatility in the market, you know, well, so we're going to make money somehow, right? People basically acknowledge this, but they're so conditioned to think that this is the system, that you just got to play with financial markets, that there's zero idea of a scientific development that should be the underpinning of your economy. And so they don't see that there's any way out. What has to be discussed, and it is increasingly the discussion, is that what China is doing, which is the LaRouche program, and which we intend to make international around the new Silk Road, is if people can get an insight that this is real and that this is an expression of truth in terms of real human progress in economy, then I think we can get a shift where people give up the ghost of the old dead system. Now I want to just read one quote from the head of the World Bank. Okay, so the World Bank president, Jim Yong Kim, he's a Korean by birth, was being attacked by the United States Treasury. And the attack was on the question that the World Bank is now lending to China. And so the World Bank president, Jim Yong Kim, defended the World Bank, saying that, look, the rationale for us working in China is quite clear. Not only are we helping them along the development path, but the lessons we learn in China are very helpful to work in other developing countries. And then he says that the Belt and Road Initiative, which the media, CGTN, which is sort of like China's BBC, or their one of their national television stations, or actually their English language television stations, noted that the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road concept, is now being highlighted at the IMF World Bank meetings that are in Washington this past week. So that's interesting, just the fact that this is even being discussed. But what the president of the World Bank goes on to say is that the Belt and Road Initiative represented strong leadership and an embrace of multilateral approaches to solving difficult problems. So that's the other thing that's going on, is in addition to major leaders and institutions within the transatlantic banking system acknowledging that the whole crap pile is about ready to blow, you're also getting others who are saying, but there's another game in town. There's another alternative to this failed dead system, and China is proving that it works. For all the criticisms that are levied against them. And the criticisms are real too. In fact, The Economist, which is one of the mouthpieces of the British Empire, I believe has a threat to Xi Jinping. It actually goes after Xi Jinping personally. So this is the recent edition of The Economist. It says that the title, cover story is entitled, "The World's Most Powerful Man. Xi Jinping has more clout than Donald Trump. The world should be wary." Okay, so then it says, it talks about how the Belt and Road, they say, hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese money are to be invested abroad in railways, ports, power stations, and other infrastructure that will help vast swaths of the world to prosper. That is the kind of leadership America has not shown since the post-war days of the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. Now, this is funny because, of course, The Economist is sort of saying, well, what China is doing with the Belt and Road, with the new Silk Road, used to be what the United States did. But it's been them and the British imperial subversion of the United States that has prevented us from doing this. But I think they're basically trying to hint that China is now taking leadership because they're actually providing real economic development for these other nations, especially the nations of Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, so on. So what the Economist then goes on to say is a veiled threat to China and Xi Jinping that they will try to do what they did to the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union broke up, which is their intention in the early 90s, which is actually the discussion which Lyndon LaRouche and his wife Helga introduced the new Silk Road concept, was to bring people together through economic development, uplifting people, versus what the British did, which is came in and split nations up, brought in the shock therapy of the International Monetary Fund to Russia, said, we're going to bring you the so-called free market and the wonderful riches, and what they actually did is brought in the London School of Economic trained Russian oligarchs that basically just privatized Russia and looted the hell out of it, all to the benefit of Wall Street in London. So anyway, that's actually what happened with the breakup of the Soviet Union, but what The Economist does is threaten China and Xi Jinping that they'll do the same thing that they tried to do to Russia, except for what Vladimir Putin and company did to reverse it. So anyway, it says, The Economist article says, unlike Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, Mr. Xi, is not a global troublemaker who seeks to subvert democracy and destabilize the West. At home, Mr. Xi's instincts are at least as illiberal as those of his Russian counterpart. He believes that even a little political permissiveness could prove not only his own undoing, but that of his regime. The fate of the Soviet Union haunts him, and that insecurity has consequences. He mistrusts not only the enemies his purges have created, but also China's fast-growing, smartphone-wielding middle class and the shoots of civil society that were sprouting when he took over. And they go on to talk about how he's running a surveillance state and stifling human rights and so on and so forth, right? So, but clearly the attack on Xi Jinping that The Economist is levying is the same kind of attack that is being leveled on Donald Trump. And that is not because these leaders are dealing with different political scenarios, some difficult, dealing with them in different ways, or better or worse, or whatever you want to call it, but because the real freak out by The Economist is that the United States, through the presidency of Donald Trump, will join Russia, the presidency of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping of Russia and China, and bring this world into a whole other domain, that the British Empire would be over. So in that context, they're running a coup d'etat. I do not have one of them in front of me, but perhaps Anastasia, okay, here we go. Let me just...
The dossier?
Yes, this is the dossier that we are circulating. Robert Mueller is an amoral legal assassin. He will do his job if you let him. Now this is, of course, Robert Swan Mueller III, of total British pedigree, not that he's English as a nationality or something, but that it comes from this imperial outlook and the training ground for that. This man has been nothing other than what is stated on this. In the 1980s, when Mr. LaRouche was being rounded up, his associates were being rounded up, and our printing offices were being shut down in Northern Virginia on fraudulent claims against LaRouche. Robert Mueller was there behind it all. And this dossier does a very good job of showing that that's been his job. Is any president, which in this case was Ronald Reagan, who brought in LaRouche for the ideas around the Strategic Defense Initiative, among other. The Reagan administration wasn't just interested in the SDI. There was a whole slew of economic policies, but also diplomatic relations that Reagan was interested in working with LaRouche on. Similarly with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, one of the first things that when LaRouche was let out of prison because of what Clinton had done to get him out, is in the middle of the 1990s when LaRouche was out of prison, he went on behalf of people within the Clinton administration back to Russia to begin discussing the kind of collaborative approaches that were actually ongoing at this time around the new Silk Road and the emerging multipolar world. So, but Mueller was behind then the attacks on, it was in the backgrounds in terms of the attacks on Clinton, and was instrumental in covering up for 9/11, and the list goes on. But this is now the special counsel who has virtually unlimited power to run witch hunts and intimidate people, to get them to falsify stories, whatever it is that he has to do to paint the picture of Trump's collusion with Russia. Now on that note, just to be very clear about this, there is zero evidence been supplied so far through the normal channels. Richard Burr actually made, the senator who was in charge of the Senate Intelligence Committee, made a relatively straightforward admission of this. He said, look, we've interviewed hundreds of witnesses. We haven't found one shred of evidence in terms of Russia's collusion to subvert the election. Just not there. However, we will continue the investigation. We still have more witnesses left because the intelligence community tells us that Russia did interfere in the election, right? Now people remember the supposed 17 of the intelligence agencies, which most Americans said 17, I can't even think of 3, you know, the FBI, the CIA, whatever, NSA, 17 agencies all agree. Now later they had to backtrack on that story because it wasn't all 17, it was 4. Not only was it 4, which of course was the NSA, the FBI, the CIA, and I forget, the DIA maybe, which was a political appointee under Obama. Not only was it not only just 4 intelligence agencies, but it was hand-picked analysts. Now, what the hell is that? You can just choose somebody who's politically aligned with you, put them on a panel and say, feed us the intelligence that we want, which is that Russia subverted our democracy and stole the election, right? So, but anyway, the Senate has admitted, the Intelligence Committee has admitted, they don't have anything. They're saying they're going to keep the investigation going, but they don't have anything. So what has just come out is on the question of Mueller running this witch hunt, which is all that it is they're going to find something, not because they have some concern about Donald Trump and, you know, does he take on political issues, you know. I just want to make one brief point on this because Helga Zeppler-Rusch has made this point. She has made the point that were Donald Trump to move the United States into collaboration with the New Silk Road and collaboration with Russia and China, then he would be the greatest president the United States has ever seen. Because of just how earth-shaking this transformation would be, and that this would be the end of the era of British geopolitics and the British Empire. However, he has to do that. In other words, we're not just we're defending this presidency not because we think that it'd be good to gather a bunch of people in the room to get behind Donald Trump on the NFL strike, for example, you know, and say that people shouldn't take a knee or whatever. I'm not saying there's a lot of issues that Hollywood is behind. Forgive me for saying this, for you, those of you that are the Seahawks fans in the room. I don't really even believe that the big ticket sports is all that legitimate anymore. I think most of it's probably run by Vegas bookies. So anyway, so whether we see, you know, how much of this is actually political and being charged by financial interests that are behind Vegas, which is ultimately Wall Street. I'm not saying that these are illegitimate issues, but what I'm saying is we should take the approach that Helga is saying, is that we're defending this presidency and we're pushing the United States and the people and the institutions to get behind the Trump administration moving in this direction, which they have signaled their openness to. Yang Jiechi, the state counselor of China, said after a meeting with the Trump administration earlier on, this was back in, I think it was March or February, whatever it was, that Trump had endorsed the New Silk Road. Okay, so that we know that this is the direction that they would like to move, and it makes sense. I mean, if you're a businessman, you would look at what's going on around the world, and you could identify that this would be a critical, and that is our intention, and that's what we have to do is vector things in that, not all these other things that come up in the course of the coup and the attempts to defame Trump, which might seem like separate issues, but the overarching issue is that the British Empire views that if the United States enters into this, they're done, and they know it. So that is the point of us circulating this dossier. I just want to just briefly reference the fact that 19 members of Congress just wrote a letter to Grassley and Goodlatte, Senator Grassley, Representative Goodlatte of Virginia, Grassley's from Iowa, who are the chairs of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the House Judiciary Committee. And they're basically saying, look, Mueller is running an operation unaccountable to the American people. They refer to the fact that a U.S. attorney has to be confirmed by the Senate. Mueller and his team of lawyers, who are arguably just as empowered, if not more so, than any U.S. attorney, have afforded Congress and the public no such opportunity to actually be questioned or, held accountable in any way. They say that these are the members of the Congress that sent this letter to Grassley and Goodlatte. Mueller and his team have sweeping authority and an open-ended mission, yet they are allowed to operate largely in secret, selected by and ultimately accountable to only one person, Mr. Mueller himself. So, and they go on to discuss the conflict of interest and so on, and then they say, accordingly, we respectfully request that one or both of the Judiciary Committees immediately convene a public and open hearing or series of hearings to bring Mr. Mueller and his team out of the shadows and into the public square. So, and then they add, the American people deserve it. They are, after all, paying for it, which might be a minor point in the middle of a coup d'etat, but it's kind of one of these funny things that sometimes that gets the American people riled up. Wait a second, we're paying for this, and you don't even know what the hell's going on with it. So anyway, but point being, this is our circulation of this is having an effect, and there's other, in terms of targets that we had with this grouping of getting the word out, and just making it clear that this is just totally. The way that it should do is you should have the Senate and the Congress investigating the executive branch if they think that there's breaches of, working with a foreign government. But of course, as we see, the Senate has already said there ain't no evidence.
Right.
So yet you have this guy Mueller run this shadow operation where he has grand jury capabilities, subpoena power. He can haul people into dark little rooms and threaten them and tell them that you're going to steal everything they own, and if they don't get behind coming up with the evidence that Russia's colluding, or the Trump administration was colluding with Russia to, whatever, to get elected. So, I think, there's probably more I could say, but I just want to give a brief sense that that's actually where we intend to drive the situation. We're going to expose this coup d'etat, and we seek to make sure that the presidencies of Donald Trump can engage and collaborate and fulfill really a historic mission of the United States to work with these other nations. And so what I'd like to do, maybe as a way of just giving a sense of this, the FBI has not had they haven't really done much of anything good for the United States, and it's always been because it's been a British operation since the beginning. The precursor to the Federal Bureau of Investigation was what was called the Bureau of Investigation. And the guy that actually started it, this was under Theodore Roosevelt's time, was a guy named Charles Bonaparte. How many of you have heard the name Bonaparte?
Yeah.
Okay, so he was actually the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, right? Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon I Bonaparte, was of course involved in the continuation of the British program, British geopolitical program, which has always been to target Russia, as preventing Russia from acting as a bridge between Asia and Europe. As we know, Napoleon had to leave Moscow after a brutal winter and basically having their forces decimated. Napoleon III was involved in the Crimea War in the middle of the 1800s. So at the same time that Lincoln was facing the British onslaught of the South, which was all funded by the British, somewhat covertly, somewhat not necessarily openly, although Alexander II of Russia knew it and Lincoln knew it. But at the same time that we were engaged in the Civil War here, British instigated, the British were also instigating a war against Russia called the Crimea War. People probably remember Crimea in the recent terms. Remember, that's the big reason that Russia is the big bad people, because they're trying to take over Ukraine's territory. Of course, no one mentions the fact that Crimea has been a part of Russia since like the 1600s. But anyway, this was Napoleon III. It was involved in this with the British and also the Turks. So I mention that because what this was in terms of why the British were going after Russia and what the whole issue, because at the same time they were going after the United States with the Civil War, Russia through the Crimean War. There was operations in India to make sure that they kept their stronghold in India as part of the British East India Company. And there were also operations in China, which of course they had Shanghai, Hong Kong. These were as part of their control. But anyway, the point is that the first director of the FBI, or the precursor to the FBI, comes out of that same imperial tradition, that same geopolitical thinking. Now, that geopolitical thinking, I'm just going to cover some of this just somewhat briefly. This is a diagram that Halford Mackinder developed. And Mackinder was around in the late 1800s. He wrote the Geographical Pivot of History in 1904. Now, the context of which he's writing this and what he's getting at is he discusses that the way that he describes it later is he says, who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland, and the heartland would basically be Russia and the Eurasian continent. Who controls the heartland controls the world island, which is essentially Europe, Asia, and Africa, and who controls the world island controls the world. So this was the geopolitical thinking of Mackinder, okay? And so they saw very much that they had to control Eastern Europe, make sure that Russia did not act as this bridge, because what was going on at the end of the 1800s when Mackinder was writing his theory was this, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Okay, now, this was developed literally in the same spirit as what Abraham Lincoln did to bring the East and West Coast together with the Transcontinental Railroad that ultimately went to San Francisco and connected up the East Coast, which brought the nation together. And Sergei Witte, who was an economist who was in Russia, was one of the key instigators of this, was a huge fan of the American system. Now, Paul's going to get to what we mean by the American system and some of the philosophical underpinnings of that. But this was an extreme freak out by the British. Why? Well, we know this is how the British operated their empire, which was a maritime empire. Well, what happens if you have nations beginning to come together internally around development corridors, because what's going to happen along this route is a whole slew of economic development. At the same time that this discussion was going on with the Trans-Siberian Railroad, there was also this, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad. Now look where that cuts through. That's the so-called Balkans area. Okay, so now think about this. Where were the two hot seats of the world wars that we eventually saw? Remember the Balkans? Started down there with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, all that. People remember it from the history lessons. That was to break up the potential of this kind of economic development, which was in the spirit of, in the spirit of the old Silk Road, but was also in the spirit of what the American system actually represented. Because we were not interested in defeating the British Empire on our soil and having this kind of economic potential that we saw under the economic policy of Alexander Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, Henry Carey, who was the economic advisor of Lincoln. That wasn't just meant for us. We wanted to spread that concept globally, and we wanted to bring all nations in as equal brothers and sisters of republics that could have a common say in the economic development of humanity as a whole. So these were direct outgrowths of the ideas of the American system people, like Henry Carey, who was literally going around trying to recruit people into these major development policies. And so think about the other place where the world wars were a major theater. Remember around we had the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War at the end of the 1800s. What was that about? Well, that was about if China were to connect into the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and then people like Sun Yat-sen, forgive my, I guess I don't have a picture of Sun Yat-sen other than that this is his burial place. This is actually on, I think it's on Taiwan. They have a, and there's complexities to that, and I'm not going to get into all of that question of Taiwan and Chiang Kai-shek and so on, but notice these two, I think those are kind of similar. Okay, well before that, this was during World War I, was that there were literally stamps that had of the people, by the people, for the people. Diana, can you, is that of the people, by the people, for the people? In Chinese, which was Sun Yat-sen's ideas. So they very much, the early development of China, and Sun Yat-sen, interestingly, he was also a Christian, which I want to read a quote from our friend Gottfried Leibniz. Actually, I'm kind of jumping around a lot here, but I want to make the point here that what the American system itself is an outgrowth of the Renaissance tradition. And there perhaps is no, okay. This is the map that Sun Yat-sen had developed of what he wanted to be railroads for China back in the early 1900s. Okay, now China hasn't even got to they've been building a lot, but they haven't even got this far yet. And Sun Yat-sen had outlined this way back when as something that he saw would be good for China. He hated the British Empire. He admired the American Revolution, and he thought there could be a world of sovereign republics that collaborated with each other based around these same kind of principles of the people, by the people, for the people. Is that, which was a very Confucian idea, and I believe interesting, or was also a Christian conception as well. And so when the British thought, well, what would happen were that kind of rail grid in China to connect up through the Trans-Siberian Railroad, it'd be all over for the British. So what did they do? They convinced Japan, look, you could be an island empire like us, sitting off the coast, manipulating the mainland. You could do the same thing that we do, and they put a lot of money into recruiting people and manipulating people, and they convinced China to attack around the Korean Peninsula. And that, huh?
You meant Japan?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Japan. Sorry, they convinced Japan to attack and launch the war against China and Russia as part of the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. So that was the end of the 1800s. And that is the period of which Mackinder and his crowd were outlining what the point of British geopolitics was that they could not allow that to occur. They could not allow China to connect through Russia into Europe because their maritime empire would be over. So that's what British geopolitics is. And I mentioned Leibniz because I think that as the best of the European Renaissance, which was not just simply art, there was a component of actually political component, which is the creation of republics. That was very much the intention of the Renaissance. But what Leibniz had as an idea is that, well, I'll just read his quote because it's better said. He says, so Leibniz lived from 1646 to 1714. So this, of course, is well before the American Revolution occurred. He had his hands in organizing those that were around before the American Revolution, around the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was in discussions with people all over Ireland, all over France, and so on, that we could actually have republics that would collaborate. We didn't need this imperial, world anymore. So what Leibniz says concerning China and Europe, or the potential connection, he said, "I consider it a single plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were," so consider he's talking about the 1600s here, late 1600s. So he says, "I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement, so that as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. I do not think it an accident that the Russians, whose vast realm connects Europe with China, and who hold sway over the deep barbarian lands of the north by the shore of the frozen ocean, should be led to the elimination of our ways through the strenuous efforts of their present ruler." So their present ruler was Peter the Great, and Leibniz eventually instigated what Peter the Great set up as the Russian Academy of Sciences, which today actually has LaRouche as one of their honorary members, just as a kind of an interesting span of development. But if you think about it, this has been a long concept that, and Leibniz had it, that the idea that the Confucian tradition of China and the Renaissance Christian tradition of Europe, that they could be united in terms of a similar outlook, and that Russia could play that bridge. And that is what the British have freaked out about since the very beginning, and what the core of British geopolitics was to prevent that from occurring. Okay, now, so I'm kind of just jumping all over the place here, but what I want to get into is that there's another side to the geopolitical control. Yes, they wanted to prevent railroads from occurring across the Eurasian continent so they could keep their maritime empire. But eventually the British realized you had to do this through a different way and through a subversion of the intellectual or the minds of the population. As I mentioned, Winston Churchill once said that the future of the British Empire would be the empires of the mind, right? Well, the British have known that for a long time, long before Winston Churchill. And one of the early indications of this, and really the crowd that people like Mackinder, who ran this geographical pivot of history, you know, the geopolitics, Mackinder came out of the tradition that was largely overseen by this guy, John Ruskin. Now, I'm not giving him, he was just a kind of an organizer of things, but it was the British Empire and Victoria and her gang that bequeathed upon these guys the kind of the intellectual authority to organize a cadre that would carry out the British imperial policy. John Ruskin, also with a guy named Benjamin Jowett. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the big, thick Plato translations. Jowett was one of the key translators of Plato, or I should say mistranslators, according to Mr. LaRouche. But Ruskin and his gang, and Jowett, and then some of his proteges, founded an organization called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Okay, now, what do they mean by pre-Raphael? Well, I'll read a quote from one of their key people. He says, this is from William Morris. He's one of these pre-Raphaelite types that work with Ruskin. He says, "The leading passion of my life is hatred of modern civilization. The only healthy civilization was that of the Middle Ages, before the decline set in with the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution." So what they mean by pre-Raphaelite is literally Raphael, who's painting, this is one of his more famous paintings, who was one of the key elements of the Renaissance, is they wanted to go back before the Renaissance. And I think Raphael gets the fundamental distinct idea of the Renaissance, which is this painting here. In the middle, you can see Plato doing this and Aristotle doing this, right? Now, what does that mean? Well, that defined the whole issue of the Renaissance, was the imperial tradition of an Aristotelian mindset, was that man could only know through the senses. We were limited to that which is our earthly sensual pleasures. Whereas Plato argued that there was something else, that there was the domain of the human mind that could discover principles that were operable beyond the senses of what you see within your senses, whereas Aristotle said, no, it's only your senses. So that's what they wanted to reverse, was that Renaissance tradition and go back to the Middle Ages. So these are some of the paintings. You people may recognize these. These are the pre-Raphaelites and what they were promoting. So this is Lady Godiva, the painting, just to give a sense of how close this was. John Collier, who is the painter for this, who was part of this pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, John Collier was married to the daughter of Thomas Huxley. Okay, Thomas Huxley was like the guy that promoted Darwin, promoted the whole idea that what Darwin was saying about survival of the fittest should be applied to human economy and social systems. His grandsons, Aldous and Julian, Aldous wrote A Brave New World and was like one of the big acid freaks that led the drug revolution in the 60s here in this country. Julian Huxley was the first head of UNESCO, which I guess Trump just pulled out of UNESCO. I don't really know what that means, but what his idea of that is. But Julian Huxley was also the first head of the World Wildlife Foundation. Remember, this is the umbrella group for the beginning of the environmentalist organization, founded by Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard. Prince Philip's the husband of Queen Elizabeth. And then Julian Huxley, in addition to being the first president of the World Wildlife Foundation, was the president of the British Eugenics Society too. So this is these people who wanted to go back to the happy medieval days. What did they really want? They wanted British feudalism to rule, to prevent economic development. That's what environmentalism was. It wasn't to be good to the environment. It was a political means by which you tell the people of Africa, the people of South America, the people of Asia, that you can't develop your land because your pristine nature is so important, and you can't possibly use your mind to develop properly because you're just a bunch of dumb peasants and should be part of our feudal society. Right? But this is where this attitude came from. In fact, and so they sort of promoted this whole, kind of, well, in this case, it's more explicit. You're literally riding out to conquer the lands on behalf of the British Empire, and, kind of have this romantic view of it all. But that's what Ruskin and his gang wanted. Now, one of Ruskin's key students was Cecil Rhodes. As you can see, this was the British idea of what their domination of Africa was. And that's what all of the students of Ruskin and the pre-Raphaelite crowd promoted, was people like Cecil Rhodes and Mackinder, that we're going to go and subjugate and control these lands and have the British Empire continue its global domination, but that it was going to be also a domination where we would get the peasants to accept and embrace their own feudalism through an anti-development policy, through a zero-growth economy. And so, because we're kind of running, I think we got a little bit of a late start, and there's probably more that could be said about this, but this is the crowd that Russell came out of. Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, they were all a part of this British geopolitical crowd, all a part of this cultural tradition that came from these pre-Raphaelite brotherhoods that were promoting this ancient feudal tradition. And it was Russell who went, after we had the war, the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, in the lead up in between World War I and World War II, Sun Yat-sen was about ready to consolidate China towards this pro-development perspective that would be, nations collaborating around a series of republics that would, based on these large economic development policies, right? And so Russell went into China to try to subvert that, and literally met with Chairman Mao. He began to organize these kind of circles that, wouldn't it be better that you didn't have the evils of modern industrialism and what you see with the problems that this bring? Wouldn't it be better to just adopt the idea that you don't have to have a pro-growth orientation? You could have a zero-growth, sustainable conception. But it was Russell that began to organize this kind of ideals in China. He was doing the same thing in Russia, which sort of later became more incorporated within the IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which kind of took the same concept that you didn't actually need economic development. You didn't need human progress, scientific advancement, technological advancement as the underpinning of your economy. You could just have this zero growth economy, and everybody just sort of live within the boundaries of the land, the kind of the noble peasant concept. So anyway, like I say, there could be a lot more that is said on that, but I only just kind of gave that scope, or that broad brush, as a kind of a introduction to what British geopolitics was in terms of a policy, what they wanted to prevent, which was the spread of the American system and the collaboration between a system of sovereign republics, and that they would do this through the kind of subversive methods, and also fomenting wars and getting people to fight against each other, as we saw in the case of Japan, but that they also, through people like Russell, would do it culturally, to try to subvert people to adopt an outlook that says that human progress and a creation of a better future for the coming generations was somehow not good. And we saw this kind of at the high point of what Mao did with the Cultural Revolution, where there was an explicit attack on the family structure, which was a core of the Confucian principles. The idea that you would be considered the family unit as very almost sanctimonious, sacred. Yes, it's sacred, but it was because of that expression that this is you can promote the actual future of civilization through the promotion of your family and so on. That was very much a Confucian ideal, which was attacked under the Maoist tradition. So now here we have the potential that this kind of development policy that was flourishing and spreading, known as the American system through the 1800s, that now has come to a point of fruition within China, within Russia, within India, within the various nations. And the British see the potential of that going global. And at that point, then their system is over. I think that's actually also what's at the core of environmentalism. If you tell the American people that we need to develop, you're ultimately going to get that as one of the arguments. But what does environmentalism state? That you can't, that everything's in a stasis situation. And that anytime you develop, it's a kind of a zero-sum game, that development means the rape and looting and pillaging of Mother Nature or other people to do it. But what we know through science and technology is that it's not a zero-sum game. It is the win-win, as the Chinese are describing it with the New Silk Road. That Kennedy once said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." That you can actually have everybody develop through science and technology and lift everybody up. And so what the British now see is that if this comes into existence as a global policy, they are finished. And this is actually what is behind the coup. And the concern, of course, is that LaRouche's ideas, the ideas contained in the 4 laws, which if you haven't read it, I know we have that back there. I think we do, yeah? That becomes hegemonic in thinking and overrides this zero growth mentality, this anti-development policy.